You made me miss her funeral. The words cut through the ballroom air like shattered glass. Crystal chandeliers trembled with their echo. Every eye turned toward the maid standing beneath the golden arches, her trembling hands still gripping a tray, her voice breaking into the impossible hush that followed. Damien Whitmore froze mid-step, his wineglass halfway to his lips. The crowd of investors, politicians, and socialites stilled, unsure whether to breathe. For a moment, no one recognized her. The quiet black maid who always moved like a shadow through his marble halls. But now, under the light, Naomi Ellison's tears glistened like fire. Her eyes locked on Damien's, those sharp, cold blue eyes that had once reduced her to silence. Tonight, they met hers and faltered. The tray fell, a hollow clang against the marble. The sound lingered. And just like that, the story began. 6 months earlier, Whitmore Estate glowed under the morning sun, a glass-and-stone fortress overlooking the New York skyline. Inside, silence ruled. Every breath, every footstep, was swallowed by the vastness of wealth. Naomi moved quietly through the great hall, her black uniform pressed to perfection. The smell of polish and lemon oil followed her wherever she went. She was small-framed, graceful, and habitually careful. Careful not to speak too loud, not to make eye contact too long, not to leave fingerprints on glass. She'd been there for only 5 months, but she already understood the house's rhythm, Damien Whitmore's rhythm. He rose at 5:30 a.m., swam exactly 40 laps in the rooftop pool, and never ate breakfast. He demanded absolute precision. Towels folded in threes, coffee brewed at 198 degrees, not a trace of dust on his grand piano, though he hadn't played it in years. Naomi often caught herself glancing at that piano. Black lacquered, silent beneath a gauze of sunlight. She imagined the notes that once lived there, then turned away, polishing the marble instead. Damien passed her once that morning, tall, impeccably dressed, phone in hand, face as expressionless as stone. "You missed a spot," he said without looking. She didn't respond, only bent lower and wiped again. His cologne trailed behind him, cool, metallic, impersonal. It was only after he disappeared into his office that she allowed herself a breath. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. One message from her sister. "Mom's not doing well. Call me when you can." Naomi's stomach knotted. She hid in the pantry, whispering into the phone, her voice shaking. "She's stable now," her sister said softly. "But the doctors think you should come home soon." Naomi's throat closed. Her mother, the woman who raised her with lullabies and wisdom in a small Georgia kitchen, was slipping away. "I'll ask for time off," Naomi murmured. "I promise." But that promise would soon be crushed by the man who never allowed weakness to exist near him. Later that day, Naomi stood outside Damien's study, heart pounding. The heavy oak door loomed like a gate to judgment. She knocked once. "Come in." He didn't look up when she entered. His desk was lined with contracts, his eyes fixed on a glowing screen. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, voice fragile. I need to request a few days off. My mother—" He raised a hand, silencing her. "You're aware this week we have the Whitmore Foundation Gala?" "Yes, sir, but—" He set down his pen, finally meeting her eyes. They were piercing, glacial blue, with not a hint of sympathy. "This household runs on schedule. If I allow one person to disrupt it, everyone follows." Tears welled in Naomi's eyes. "Please, sir, she's dying." The words hung there, trembling in the air between them. Damien leaned back, expression unreadable. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said flatly. "But I need you here." Naomi stood frozen, lips parted. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "Dismissed," he added. Her voice cracked. "You don't understand." He turned away, already reaching for his phone. "I do. That's why I said no." The door closed softly behind her, but the echo of his indifference stayed. That night, Naomi sat in her small quarters behind the servants' wing, staring at her mother's photo. A warm smile, silver hair wrapped in a scarf, eyes full of love. The phone call came just before midnight. Her mother was gone. Naomi's knees gave out. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her as her breath caught in her chest. She whispered into the dark, "Mama, I'm sorry." "I tried." Outside, the city lights glimmered. Indifferent, beautiful, cruel. The next morning, she put on her uniform and went to work as if nothing had happened. By noon, she stood before that same grand piano, wiping its polished surface with shaking hands. The reflection staring back at her was hollow. Damien passed by again, glancing briefly at her face, pale, eyes red. "You look tired," he said simply. "If you're sick, don't spread it around." Naomi didn't answer. She just kept wiping, over and over, until the piano gleamed like a mirror. And when she was sure he couldn't hear her, she whispered to the reflection, "One day, you'll see what you took from me." That night, the estate glittered with light. A business dinner, laughter, music. Naomi moved silently through the room, serving wine, pretending not to exist. But grief has a strange way of reshaping silence. It doesn't stay hidden. It leaks into movement, into eyes, into the air. Damien noticed, if only for a moment. Something unreadable flickered in his gaze as he watched her pour drinks with trembling hands. He didn't know then that her mother's funeral was taking place that very moment, hundreds of miles away, beneath the Georgia rain, and Naomi, the maid he refused, was standing in his mansion, polishing glass while her mother's coffin sank into the earth. The softest sound escaped her throat, like a sob swallowed too late. Damien turned his head slightly, confused, but said nothing, because men like him didn't ask questions about pain. Not yet. It rained for 3 days straight after her mother's funeral, as though the sky itself mourned what Naomi could not. She didn't speak to anyone. She moved through Whitmore Estate like a ghost in pressed linen, her face calm, her hands steady. But inside, something was shifting. The quiet girl who once apologized for existing now felt a cold, steady flame burning behind her ribs. The world had taken too much from her already, and Damien Whitmore had been the last to twist the knife. The following Monday began like all others. Precise, sterile, silent. The staff moved on clockwork. The scent of lavender polish filled the halls. Damien descended the main staircase at exactly 7:00 a.m., his shoes tapping against marble with a rhythm that sounded more like authority than movement. He was immaculate. As always, tailored navy suit, wrist watch that glinted like steel, hair slicked back without a strand out of place. His expression carried that same controlled detachment that made people both fear and admire him. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," murmured the head butler. Damien nodded once, eyes already on his tablet. Naomi stood at the far end of the hall, polishing the glass banister. When his gaze brushed over her, Something inside her twisted. That same face. That same calm that had destroyed her world with two indifferent words. "I need you here." "Naomi," he said suddenly. She stiffened. "Yes, sir?" "There's a dinner tomorrow night with the investors from Geneva. You'll handle the serving. Mr. Cole from the kitchen will coordinate the courses." "Yes, sir." He paused for a fraction of a second, noticing, perhaps for the first time, how her voice didn't tremble anymore. It was quiet but grounded, almost cold. Then he turned away. "Make sure everything's flawless." Naomi watched him leave, jaw tight. Flawless, she thought bitterly. Even your cruelty has to be flawless. In her small servant quarters that night, Naomi unpacked a small cardboard box. Inside were things she hadn't touched in months. A letter her mother had written before she got sick, an old photograph of them at the kitchen table, and a tiny silver cross that used to hang above her mother's bed. The letter read, "My sweet girl, don't let this world harden you. You were born gentle. That's your strength. One day, someone will see what I've always seen." Naomi pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, "You were wrong about him. Mama, he doesn't see anyone." But still, she didn't cry. The tears had burned out days ago. The next evening, the estate came alive. Long glass tables gleamed beneath chandeliers. The city skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Men in tuxedos and women in silk gowns filled the air with laughter, money, and pride. Naomi moved through it all unseen, carrying trays of champagne, serving dishes polished to perfection. Every movement was controlled, until the moment it wasn't. Near the piano, a man in a gray suit called out, "Hey, sweetheart, over here!" Naomi turned, forcing a polite smile, and began pouring his drink. The man leaned closer. His breath smelled of whiskey. "You must love working here, huh? Heard Whitmore pays his help well." "I'm grateful for the job, sir," she said softly. "Grateful?" he echoed, smirking. "Bet he doesn't let you off easy, though." "Looks like the type that keeps everyone on a leash," Damien's voice cut in sharply. "Is there a problem, Mr. Hensley?" The man chuckled. "Not at all. Just making conversation." Damien's jaw tightened. His blue eyes flicked briefly toward Naomi, then back to his guest. "Keep your conversations professional." For a second, just a second, Naomi saw something flicker behind his composure. A hint of discomfort, maybe guilt. Then it vanished. She nodded quietly and stepped away, heart pounding. But fate was cruel that night. As she turned with a tray of wine glasses, someone brushed her shoulder. One glass tipped, just enough to spill crimson wine across Damien's immaculate suit. The room froze. Every gaze swung toward her. The violin music faltered. Damien looked down at his stained lapel, then up at Naomi. His voice was low but sharp enough to slice. "Do you have any idea what that suit cost?" Naomi's hands trembled. "I'm sorry, sir. It was an accident." "Accidents don't happen when people pay attention," he snapped. "Clean it up. Now!" The humiliation was instant and total. Dozens of eyes watched her kneel at his feet, blotting the expensive fabric with trembling hands while he stood over her, expression cold. She felt the sting of tears, the echo of every buried sorrow roaring back. Her mother. The funeral she never attended. His words, "I need you here." Something inside her finally cracked. When the stain was gone, she rose slowly, her voice steady but soft. "You're right, sir. I should have paid more attention." He turned away, dismissive. Make sure it doesn't happen again. But as Naomi walked back toward the kitchen, her heart had already crossed a line she could never return from. Later that night, long after the guests had gone, Damien found something unusual. On his desk lay a folded envelope, cream paper, no name. He frowned, opening it. Inside was a letter written in delicate handwriting. The words were uneven, ink smudged by tears. Mama, I missed your funeral today. I was cleaning another woman's floors while they laid you to rest. I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. I tried to ask, but he said no. Maybe one day he'll understand what he took from me. But even if he doesn't, I forgive him, because you taught me how. I'll make you proud, somehow. For the first time in years, Damien felt his chest tighten. He looked at the signature. Naomi. And something inside him, something buried deep under years of power and perfection, began to stir. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back on the desk, and stared at it long into the night. The rain stopped the next morning. The city glowed, but inside the Whitmore estate, the air had changed. Damien couldn't stop seeing the words of that letter every time he saw her face. When Naomi passed him in the hall, her eyes didn't lower anymore. They didn't meet his either. They simply looked through him, as if he were a shadow she no longer feared. And for Damien Whitmore, that was the first time in his life that silence felt like punishment. It began with the piano. Damien didn't remember when he last touched it. The instrument had sat in his living room for years, polished, silent, untuned. But now, every time he walked past it, he heard phantom notes that weren't there, notes that sounded like guilt. He couldn't focus. The letter haunted him. He found himself reading it again late at night, tracing the careful strokes of Naomi's handwriting, hearing her voice in every word. I forgive him because you taught me how. Forgiveness. It was something he'd never received, nor given. But it was that line, I missed your funeral today, that crushed him most. It gnawed at him while he worked, ate, even as he tried to sleep. He started to notice things he'd never seen before. How Naomi's hands were cracked from scrubbing marble floors, how she stayed up long after others had gone to bed, how she barely spoke anymore. He noticed the way other staff members flinched when he walked by, how his own name seemed to silence rooms. He had built an empire out of fear. And now, standing in the middle of his own mansion, Damien felt the weight of that empire pressing on his chest. Naomi moved quietly through the library that afternoon, dusting the long shelves that stretched toward the skylight. Sunlight pooled across her dark skin, soft and gold. Her face was calm, but her eyes, those deep, solemn eyes, seemed somewhere else. Damien watched from the doorway. He didn't plan to speak. He only meant to look, to understand. But the words slipped out before he could stop them. Naomi, she turned, startled but composed. Sir, he hesitated. It wasn't often that he didn't know what to say. You've been here for 6 months now. Yes, sir. You're efficient, reliable. Her lips pressed together. She knew men like him rarely offered compliments without reason. Thank you, sir. He studied her face, the steady expression, the stillness that looked like peace but wasn't. Are you? He began, then stopped. The question lodged in his throat. Are you all right? Was too small, too late. Is there something you need me to do? She asked. He shook his head. No, carry on. As he turned to leave, Naomi said softly, Sir? He looked back. I appreciate your kind words, but I'd appreciate honesty more. The air stilled. Honesty? She nodded, voice low but unshaken. When my mother passed, I begged for a day off. You said no. You didn't ask why I needed it. You didn't even look at me. That was honest. You don't have to pretend to care now. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was calm, stripped of hope. Damien swallowed hard. Naomi, But she'd already turned back to the shelves. Excuse me, sir. I need to finish dusting. He stood there, silent, before walking away. The sound of her cloth sweeping across wood followed him down the corridor. Rhythmic, deliberate, like the steady pulse of his own remorse. That night, the house felt colder. Damien sat by the window, city lights flickering across his face. His reflection stared back at him. Handsome, yes, but hollow. The kind of man who looked powerful until you saw his eyes. He poured himself a drink, but it didn't burn the way it used to. Nothing did. His father's voice echoed from years ago. Compassion is weakness, Damien. Whitmores don't feel. They conquer. He'd believed that once, until now. When he closed his eyes, he saw Naomi standing in the rain outside his mind, alone, silent, clutching that letter. He set the glass down and picked up his phone. For the first time, he looked up her employment file, Naomi Ellison, 25. Address, Whitmore Estate Quarters. No family listed. No emergency contact. Just a note in HR's records. Requested leave denied. He exhaled slowly. God, he muttered, what have I done? Days passed. Something in the air shifted. Imperceptible to the others, but not to Naomi. Damien wasn't barking orders anymore. He spoke less. He walked slower. He lingered when he passed her, like a man trying to say something he didn't know how to. And for reasons she couldn't explain, Naomi found herself watching him too, not with affection, not yet, but with curiosity. He looked lost. One morning, she found the grand piano lid open. A single piece of sheet music lay across the keys. Claire de Lune. She touched the paper lightly, fingers trembling. It was her mother's favorite piece. When she turned, Damien was standing at the doorway. I didn't know you played, he said. She hesitated. I don't. Not really. He smiled faintly, a small, unfamiliar thing. Neither do I anymore. Their eyes met. For the first time she saw something break in his, the faintest shimmer of regret. Did you put this here? She asked quietly. He nodded once. I read your letter. Her breath hitched. You had no right. I know. His voice was soft, stripped of its usual confidence. But I read it anyway. And I'm sorry. For everything. Naomi froze, unsure how to respond. It was the first time she'd heard that word from his lips. She wanted to believe it. She really did. But pain has a long memory. She stepped closer to the piano, not looking at him. You can't undo it. I know, he said again. But maybe I can start trying. The silence that followed was heavy but fragile, like glass about to crack. Then, before he could say more, the butler appeared at the door. Mr. Whitmore, your father has arrived. Damien stiffened. He wasn't supposed to be here until next week. He insisted. Damien turned back to Naomi, his voice once more controlled. We'll talk later. But as he left, Naomi saw it. The flicker of fear behind his composure. The same kind that had lived in her since the day she arrived. And she wondered, just for a moment, if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one haunted by ghosts. That evening, The house filled with the heavy sound of footsteps and tension. Damien's father, Richard Whitmore, 68, exuded old power. Silver hair, sharp suit, eyes like knives. He was the man who built the empire, who'd made Damien what he was. Naomi, serving tea in the study, couldn't help overhearing. "I hear your staff turnover's getting sloppy," Richard said coldly. "You're going soft, son. That's how empires fall." Damien's voice was quiet. "I'm not soft, father." "Then prove it. Fire the ones who drag you down. If you don't demand fear, you'll never get respect." Naomi froze. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Through the reflection of the glass cabinet, she saw Damien's expression. Strained, pained. Then, softly, he said, "Maybe fear isn't the same as respect." Richard's face hardened. "Your mother used to say things like that." "Look where that got her." A long silence, then footsteps. Richard stormed out, leaving Damien alone in the dim light. Naomi quietly set the teacup down, her heart aching in ways she didn't understand, because for the first time she saw it. Behind the billionaire's perfection stood a son still crushed beneath his father's shadow. Later that night, she found Damien sitting alone by the piano again, his head bowed, fingers tracing silent keys. And though her pain hadn't healed, some small ember of empathy, flickered between them. Neither spoke. The silence between them said enough. The storm broke the night. The past finally surfaced. Thunder rolled over the city, casting pale flashes across Whitmore Estate's glass walls. Naomi lay awake in her quarters, unable to sleep. Every time lightning lit the room, she saw her mother's face, warm, gentle, forgiving, whispering the same question. "What will you do now, my child?" She didn't know. Forgiveness was easy to write about in a letter, harder to live inside. Down the hall, Damien hadn't slept either. He sat in the library, staring at the rain streaking down the tall windows, his father's voice replaying over and over. Fear keeps people loyal. Maybe once he believed that. Maybe he'd even built his empire on it. But now, he could barely stand the silence of his own house. He looked at the piano again, its surface still gleaming from Naomi's careful hands. And suddenly, for the first time in years, he pressed a key. One note, soft and uncertain. Then another. The melody faltered, but he kept playing, forcing his stiff fingers to remember what they'd long forgotten. When the final note died, he whispered to the empty room, "I'm sorry." And though he didn't know it, Naomi heard him. The next morning arrived bright and brittle. The storm was gone, but something lingered in its wake. Tension, unspoken and electric. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was only a week away, the largest event of the year. Invitations had gone out to hundreds of guests, from senators to CEOs. The entire staff was under pressure, and Naomi worked harder than anyone. Yet, something in her was different now. Her movements were still precise, but not submissive. Her silence wasn't obedience anymore. It was strength. When other maids whispered about the upcoming event, Naomi simply nodded and kept working. She wasn't afraid of Damien anymore. She pitied him, but Damien wasn't the same either. He had started showing up where he didn't need to be. In the kitchen, checking on dinner preparations. In the foyer, helping the butler arrange floral decor. The man who once never noticed the staff now asked, "How's everyone holding up?" The staff didn't know what to make of it. Neither did Naomi. One afternoon, as she polished the grand piano, again that haunting, beautiful piano, he approached her. "Naomi," he said quietly, his voice without command for the first time. "I need a favor." She looked up, wary. "Yes, sir?" He handed her a sheet of paper. "The foundation wants a slideshow to play during the gala. Photos of community work, volunteers, things like that. I was told you've done photography before." She blinked, surprised. "How do you know that?" He smiled faintly. "I read the rest of your file. You used to take portraits at your church." Her throat tightened. "That was a long time ago. I'd like you to help with the presentation." "I'll pay extra," Naomi hesitated. "You don't need to pay me," he frowned. "Why not?" "Because money can't fix everything." Their eyes met, his full of guilt, hers full of quiet defiance. After a moment he nodded. "You're right." She took the papers, turned to leave, then paused. "What made you ask me?" Damien looked down at the piano keys. "Because you see people, Naomi. I never did. Maybe that's why I need your help." Her chest ached, not from affection, but from something heavier, sadder. She nodded once and walked away. The days that followed blurred together in the feverish rhythm of preparation. Trucks arrived with ice sculptures, caterers rehearsed service drills, and florists lined the grand hall with white orchids. Naomi worked late every night. Yet even amid exhaustion, she found purpose again. Editing photos of children from the foundation's orphanage, old women smiling in donated coats, families rebuilding homes. The images reminded her of her mother's kindness, and, strangely, they began to remind her of Damien, too. He was changing, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. He still moved like a man used to power, but the sharpness in his tone was gone. He spoke to staff now, not at them. When the head maid sneezed, he offered her a handkerchief. When the gardener slipped on wet marble, Damien helped him up. Naomi saw it all and didn't know what to feel. One night, while she worked on the slideshow in the office, Damien appeared with 2 mugs of tea. "You look exhausted," he said softly. "I'm fine," she replied without looking up. "You haven't eaten since lunch," she sighed. "You keep track of that now?" He smiled gently, trying to. When she finally looked at him, she saw something new in his eyes. Not pity, not guilt, but a kind of humility that almost frightened her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He hesitated. "Because I can't undo what I did to you, but maybe I can start by not being that man anymore." Naomi swallowed hard. "Do you really think people change?" "I didn't," he admitted. "Until I read that letter." Her chest tightened. "That letter wasn't meant for you." "I know, but it saved me anyway." The silence that followed wasn't cold this time. It was fragile, human, real. The night of the gala arrived like thunder dressed in gold. The Whitmore estate shimmered, chandeliers blazing, strings playing, laughter spilling like champagne. Naomi wore the same uniform as always, but tonight she didn't feel small in it. She stood near the back, hands clasped, watching the slideshow she'd built appear on massive screens around the hall. Her photographs, her mother's spirit in every image, lit up the walls. Damien stood on stage, delivering his speech. But this time, his voice wasn't icy. It trembled, raw, unguarded. "I used to think success was about control," he said, "about perfection. But lately, I've learned that real strength lies in compassion, in the people who forgive us when we least deserve it." The room murmured. Naomi froze. Her heart began to hammer. Then she saw it. The next slide. It wasn't from the foundation. It was a photo of Naomi herself, taken months ago without her knowing, standing in the sunlight beside the piano, her face calm and tired but full of quiet dignity. Damien's voice broke slightly. "This is Naomi Ellison. She reminded me that humanity doesn't exist in wealth. It exists in grace." The crowd clapped politely, unaware of the history between them. But Naomi's chest filled with both fire and grief. Grace. That was her mother's word. And Damien had no right to say it. The applause faded, but she couldn't move. Her hands shook as she whispered to herself, "He doesn't get to use her word." She turned and left the hall quietly, heart pounding with something she couldn't name. Hurt, anger, maybe both. Behind her, Damien watched her go, eyes wide with a fear he hadn't felt since childhood. Because for all the change he thought he'd made, he'd just realized he still didn't understand what it truly meant to be forgiven. The night's applause still echoed in the marble halls long after the guests had gone. Silver trays lay abandoned, champagne flutes half empty, and the orchids had begun to droop under the weight of exhaustion and heat. But Naomi didn't stay to see any of it. She walked through the rain, bareheaded, coatless, until the estate's lights faded behind her. Her shoes soaked through, her uniform clung to her skin, but she didn't stop. Not when the cold bit at her arms, not when tears blurred her vision. She didn't even know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't breathe inside that mansion anymore. Damien's words still rang in her ears. She reminded me that humanity doesn't exist in wealth. It exists in grace. Grace. Her Daidriwana, mother's name. Her mother's legacy, and Damien had turned it into a performance. She found herself standing at a bus stop on the empty road. The city lights glowed in the distance like a separate world. Unreachable, indifferent. She sat on the bench, trembling, and finally let the tears come. It wasn't just the speech. It was everything. The years of humiliation, the pity in his eyes, the fact that, no matter what, he still held the power to hurt her, to speak over her, to define her story. When the bus arrived, Naomi climbed aboard and whispered to the driver, "Downtown." By morning, the world had already moved on. News articles praised the Whitmore Gala as an elegant display of generosity. Guests called Damien a changed man. Photos of the event circulated online, and in everyone, he looked radiant, redeemed, the perfect philanthropist. He should have felt proud, but he couldn't stop seeing the look on Naomi's face as she walked away. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was disappointment. He spent the morning searching the house for her. Her quarters empty, her uniform neatly folded on the bed, her name tag resting on top. By noon, the butler appeared at his door. "Sir," Miss Ellison tendered her resignation. "Effective immediately." Damien froze. "She what?" "She left this for you." A single envelope lay in his hand. Her handwriting was delicate, deliberate. He tore it open. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm glad you found peace in your new purpose. I hope you mean the words you spoke last night. But please understand, grace isn't a word to be displayed. It's something you live quietly, without audience or reward. I don't hate you anymore. I just can't stay in a place that reminds me of what I used to fear. You once told me you couldn't undo the past. Neither can I, but I can choose my future. And it isn't here. Take care of your daughter. Take care of the man you're trying to become." Naomi Damien sat down slowly, the paper shaking in his hands. For a long time, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. The words blurred into nothing as his throat closed. He thought of all the times he'd ignored her voice, dismissed her presence, reduced her to silence. And now that she'd finally spoken, she was gone. Naomi found a small apartment on the south side of the city, the kind with peeling paint and thin walls, but sunlight that came in warm and unfiltered. She took a part-time job at a community center, helping children learn art and photography. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. Sometimes, when the light hit her camera just right, she remembered her mother's voice. Every wound has its own language. Naomi, some heal in silence. She smiled then, softly, because she was finally learning to understand that language. Back at the estate, silence took on a new form. Without Naomi, the mansion felt hollow again. The piano went untouched. The staff worked quietly, almost cautiously, as though afraid to disturb the stillness. Damien's daughter, Lila, noticed first. "Daddy," she asked one morning, "where's Miss Naomi?" He hesitated. She's gone, sweetheart," Lila frowned. "Why?" He knelt to meet her eyes. "Because sometimes people need to find where they belong." "But she belonged here," Lila said simply. She made the house warm. Her innocence pierced him deeper than any accusation. He hugged her tightly, whispering into her hair, "I know. I'm sorry." Weeks passed. The press moved on. The world kept spinning, but Damien couldn't. He found himself driving through the city late at night, no destination in mind. He'd see flashes of her, a figure crossing the street, a glimpse of curly hair, and his heart would jolt, only to realize it wasn't her. One evening, his car stopped near a park where a small outdoor art fair was taking place. He almost drove past, until he saw the photographs displayed along the fence. Children painting, elderly couples dancing, and in the corner, a black and white portrait of Lila laughing at the piano. Damien stepped closer, breath caught in his throat. The signature at the bottom read, N. Ellison. He turned, and there she was. Naomi stood beside a small table, camera hanging around her neck, talking softly to a group of students. The streetlight bathed her in gold. She looked peaceful. For the first time, Damien didn't see the maid. He saw the artist, the woman, the freedom he'd once taken from her. When their eyes met, she froze. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Damien stepped forward, carefully, quietly, as though approaching something sacred. "I didn't come to take you back," he said. "I just wanted to see the person you became." Naomi studied him, the exhaustion in his face, the humility in his posture. "You didn't need to come," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "But I needed to thank you." She tilted her head. "For what?" "For walking away." Her lips parted, surprise flickering, then understanding. He smiled faintly. "You taught me something I couldn't learn in all my years of power, that redemption isn't earned in grand speeches. It's earned in silence when no one's watching." Naomi nodded slowly, her throat tightening. "Then you've learned more than most men ever will." A moment passed, not of romance, but of grace. The word that once divided them now lingered between them, weightless and real. When he turned to leave, Naomi whispered, "Mr. Whitmore?" He paused. She smiled faintly. "Take care of her, Lila. She's a bright soul." "I will," he said quietly. "And you, keep shining." And for the first time in years, both of them meant what they said. That night, as Naomi packed up her photographs, She looked up at the sky, clear, open, infinite. She finally understood what her mother had meant. Grace wasn't something given or taken. It was simply the courage to walk away, without hate, without regret, and to forgive without being asked. And somewhere, back in the silent halls of the Whitmore estate, Damien sat at the piano again. This time, he didn't play to remember. He played to let go. The Song of Forgiveness. The piano keys were dusted with faint traces of silver light when Damien touched them again. The estate was quiet. No servants, no guests, just the whisper of rain against the windows and the soft hum of the fireplace. He sat there in his white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, tie undone. For years he had filled this room with deals, dinners, and the noise of power. Now it was only him, a man and his ghosts. His fingers hovered above the keys like someone asking permission. He pressed a note, then another. The melody came haltingly at first, like language returning after a long silence. He played something soft, unfamiliar, a tune that wasn't meant for anyone else to hear. And slowly, something inside him loosened. Each note was an apology, each chord a confession. He didn't know that the estate's butler, Mr. Ellis, was standing in the doorway watching quietly, nor that his daughter, Lila, had crept downstairs and curled up by the piano leg, listening with wide eyes. When the last note faded, Lila whispered, "That sounded like her." Damien turned. "Who? Miss Naomi," she said. It sounded kind. He looked at his daughter, her innocence glowing through the dim light. For a moment, he saw Naomi's influence in her posture, the way she sat, the softness of her tone, the dignity that didn't need permission to exist. "Yes," he murmured, "it did." The next morning, Damien made a decision that startled everyone at Whitmore Holdings. He called a board meeting, and for the first time, he didn't arrive in a $1,000 suit. He wore a simple black shirt, no tie, no watch. The room fell silent. "I'm stepping down as CEO," he said. Voice calm. The board erupted in murmurs, disbelief flashing across polished faces. "Mr. Whitmore, this is unprecedented. You're at the peak of your career." "What about the Whitmore name?" Damien raised a hand. "That name lost its meaning when I forgot what it stood for." He looked out the glass walls toward the city skyline, the empire he had built. "I built towers but destroyed people. I made others carry the weight of my perfection because I couldn't carry my own shame." He signed the papers, stood, and left. No speech, no applause, just silence, the kind that heals rather than condemns. 2 weeks later, Naomi was working in the hospice garden when a delivery truck arrived. The driver stepped out, holding an envelope. "Delivery for Miss Ellison," she frowned, wiping soil from her hands, and opened it. Inside was a note on simple stationery for the Grace Foundation, a place where people find peace, not punishment, in memory of those we couldn't save, and in honor of those who still choose kindness. DW below, it was a certified donation slip for $5 million. Naomi stood still for a long time, staring at the paper. The world blurred around her, birds chirping, children laughing, wind tugging at her curls. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. Instead, she closed her eyes and whispered, "He finally understood." Months passed. The hospice bloomed into a sanctuary. Walls painted soft cream, beds lined with handmade quilts. The smell of jasmine in the hallways. Naomi worked tirelessly, not as a servant, but as a founder, a caretaker, a voice of calm. People began to speak her name with gratitude, not pity. She listens without rushing. She prays with you without words. She carries peace in her hands. One afternoon, as she watered the garden, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You still like white lilies, I see." Naomi turned. Damien stood there, dressed simply. Jeans, rolled-up sleeves, no entourage, no arrogance. His hair had grown a little longer, and the harshness in his eyes had faded into something softer. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly, "but I wanted to see what grace looks like when it's free." Naomi hesitated, heart beating fast. "This isn't my grace," she said. "It's everyone's," he nodded, smiling faintly. "Then maybe it's time I learned from it." They walked slowly through the garden paths. No grand apologies, no tears, just the kind of silence that felt right. He stopped beside a memorial plaque at the garden's edge. It read, "In loving memory of Grace Ellison, who taught her daughter to forgive." Damien knelt, brushing his fingers over the engraved letters. "I never met her," he whispered, "but I think she saved me." Naomi's throat tightened. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the billionaire who had ruined her, but the man who had broken open to rebuild himself. "You saved yourself," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, you showed me where to start." Later, as he left, he turned once more toward her. "Naomi," he said, "if you ever need anything—" She cut him off gently. "I have everything I need, Damien. And you finally have peace. Don't lose it trying to make amends forever." He exhaled, smiled, and nodded. "I won't." As he walked away, Naomi stood beneath the fading sun. The sky was painted gold and rose, colors of endings that felt like beginnings. And in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a piano, drifting through memory, mingling with the soft hum of the evening. That night, she wrote in her journal, not to her mother this time, but to herself. "There was a time when I thought forgiveness meant forgetting. But forgiveness is remembering without letting it hurt anymore. He broke me once. Then I broke the silence. And somewhere between those two things, we both became free." She closed the book and smiled. The quiet after the storm, the air in Georgia was warm and full of life. Cicadas humming in the trees, the smell of rain-soaked soil rising from the earth. Naomi Ellison stood at the edge of a small cemetery, sunlight filtering through oak branches, glinting against the engraved name that had once defined her world. Grace Ellison, 1959-2024. She gave more than she had, and left more than she took. Naomi knelt beside the grave, setting a small bouquet of lilies on the grass. Her fingers lingered over the petals, tracing their veins like old memories. "It's been a year, Mama," she whispered, "and somehow I'm still learning how to live without you." She looked up at the endless blue above her. "I used to think I had to forgive him for you, for what he made me miss. But I think maybe you wanted me to forgive him for me." A soft wind stirred her hair. The world felt impossibly still, yet alive in every breath. The hospice stood only a few miles away. The Grace Foundation, its sign simple and elegant. What began as a single donated wing had grown into a full-fledged sanctuary. Gardens, reading rooms, a children's art studio, and a quiet piano room open to anyone seeking peace. Naomi ran it with the same patience her mother had once used to bandage scraped knees. She greeted everyone with warmth, moved slowly through the halls, and always stopped to listen. Really listen, to whoever needed it. People called her Miss Naomi now, but there was no hierarchy in the title. She was friend, counselor, and comforter in equal measure. And in the evenings, when the world turned golden, she'd sit by the window and play a soft melody on the piano. Not to mourn, but to remember. It was on one of those evenings that a black sedan pulled quietly into the hospice's driveway. The nurses recognized the man before she did. Broad-shouldered, tall, his sharp features softened by time and humility. Damien Whitmore stepped out, carrying a worn leather satchel. He wasn't the man from the news anymore. No tailored suit, no entourage, no trace of arrogance. Just a man who had spent a long time learning how to live quietly. Naomi met him at the doorway. "Damien," she said, her voice calm, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Naomi." He nodded. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're not." He handed her the satchel. "I found something that belongs here." She unbuckled the flap and drew out a weathered journal. Pages filled with neat handwriting, some entries dated over a decade ago. "It's your mother's," he said softly. After she passed, the hospital sent some of her belongings to the estate. They must have been mixed with the household archives. "I found it last week while cleaning my office." Naomi's breath caught. "You kept this all this time?" "I didn't know I had it," he admitted. "But I thought, maybe it was meant to come back to you now." She held the book close, her throat tightening. "Thank you," he hesitated. "May I stay a while?" She nodded toward the garden. "Always." They walked through the flowers in silence. It was late afternoon, the light soft, forgiving. Children were painting near the fountain, their laughter mingling with the chirping of birds. The world felt gentle. Naomi stopped near a bench and sat down. "How's Lila?" Damien smiled faintly. "Happy, curious. She wants to be a teacher now." "She'll be a good one. She reminds me of you sometimes." Naomi looked down, brushing a stray petal from her knee. "You've changed, Damien." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "No, I'm still learning how to." "That's the same thing," she said, and he looked at her. Really looked. The way a man looks at the truth he once ignored. "Do you ever regret forgiving me?" he asked quietly. Naomi met his gaze, her eyes steady and kind. "No," she said after a pause. "Forgiveness isn't about the person who hurt you. It's about refusing to let that hurt keep owning your life." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You sound like her." "My mother?" he smiled. "Yes, Grace. I think she would have been proud." Naomi's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "She would have liked you," she said softly. "The version of you now." Evening settled in. The hospice lights flickered on, glowing like lanterns in the mist. Damien stood to leave, but Naomi stopped him. "Would you like to hear something?" she asked, motioning toward the piano room. He followed her inside. The small upright piano stood near the window, the same one she'd learned to play on years ago. She sat, straightened her back, and began to play. The melody was tender, haunting, a slow blend of sorrow and forgiveness. He recognized fragments of the song he had played months earlier, reshaped, softened. When she finished, the silence that followed felt holy. "That was hers," she said quietly. A hymn my mother used to hum when I was little. I added a few notes of my own. Damien's voice trembled. It's beautiful. Naomi turned to him, smiling. That's what grace sounds like when it heals. He exhaled shakily, then reached out, not to hold her, but to shake her hand. Thank you for letting me find peace in your story. She squeezed his hand gently. It was never just mine. Later, after he'd gone, Naomi sat by the piano, opening her mother's journal for the first time. My Naomi is stronger than she knows. One day she'll face the world's cruelty, and I won't be there to shield her. But she'll rise, not by fighting it, but by forgiving it. And in doing so, she'll teach someone else how to love again. Naomi closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt no pain, no anger, no lingering ache. Just peace. A month later, a letter arrived addressed to the Grace Foundation. It was handwritten, bearing a familiar signature. Naomi, I've left the city. Lila and I are moving to a small town near the coast. She says she wants to start a little school by the water, and I think I want to build it with her. Not as the man who once owned the world, but as the father who almost lost it. Thank you for teaching me that the greatest wealth is the ability to change. Damien and Naomi smiled, folding the letter neatly and tucking it into her mother's journal. Then she stepped outside, barefoot, onto the cool grass of the garden. The night air wrapped around her softly. Fireflies blinked like tiny stars among the lilies. Somewhere in the distance, a piano played. Maybe in her memory, maybe in another life, she whispered into the wind. Goodbye, Damien. And as she looked up at the heavens, Naomi Ellison, once a maid who had missed her mother's funeral, finally felt her mother's arms again, not in sorrow, but in pride, because she hadn't just survived cruelty, she had transformed it. And in that quiet after the storm, Grace, her mother's Grace, lived on.